Hello, my darlings. It's Saturday, the 18th of July, and have I got a horror story for you? It's called Gulls End, and I have written it for you today. It's a short story. I thought since I've been missing for an entire week, you might enjoy a short, sweet, dark, gory horror for tonight to make up for the fact that I've not been here all week. Shall we begin? Gulls End. Chapter 1. Saturday, the 19th of July, 1986. The first thing Charles Ashcombe noticed was the smell. Not the sea, that was expected. It was something older. Salt, tar, wet rope, and fish, all wrapped up in the scent of damp stone that had spent centuries losing arguments with the North Sea. He wound up the window of his metallic blue Ford Granada. Good Lord! Felicity looked up from her copy of Country Living. What? It smells. He searched for a suitably diplomatic phrase. Authentic. From the back seat, Victoria didn't even bother looking up from her Sony Walkman. It smells like something's died. Oliver pressed his face against the window. I think it smells brilliant. That's because you're 12, Victoria replied, removing one orange foam headphone. You also thought frog spawn smelt nice. I never said nice. You collected it. I was conducting experiments. You were breeding. Disappointment. Oliver ignored her with the well-practiced patience of a younger brother. Outside, the road dipped steeply towards the village, revealing a scatter of cottages clinging improbably to the cliffs, their red roofs glowing beneath the pale July sun. Fishing boats bobbed in the harbour. Seagulls wheeled overhead, screaming insults that only other seagulls understood. It looked exactly like the brochure, which Charles reflected was almost suspicious. I say, Felicity smiled, it's beautiful. It was. A ribbon of narrow cobbled streets tumbled towards the sea, every cottage leaning companionably against its neighbour, as though sharing centuries' worth of gossip. Window boxes overflowed with geraniums. Whitewashed walls gleamed in the afternoon light. A place where everyone probably knew everyone. Charles wasn't sure if he found that comforting or mildly alarming. The sign appeared around the final bend. Welcome to Gulls End. Population enough. Oliver frowned. That's a funny sign. Charles laughed. Village humour. Nobody else seemed convinced. Parking, as it transpired, was an act of faith. Charles attempted to reverse the Granada into a space barely wider than an optimistic bicycle. 3 elderly gentlemen watched from a bench, with expressions normally reserved for experimental surgery. One puffed thoughtfully on a pipe, another checked his watch, the third folded his newspaper. Nobody offered advice, nobody laughed, They simply watched. After 7 increasingly elaborate manoeuvres, Charles switched off the engine. There. The man with the pipe nodded. Not bad. Thank you. Took the vicar 11 attempts. Charles accepted this as a compliment. The old man smiled pleasantly. We've had worse. Their holiday cottage stood halfway down a narrow lane overlooking the sea. Grey stone, slate roof, blue front door. A brass plaque beside it read, Seafarers' Rest. Built in 1764. Oliver peered at the date. That's older than America. Victoria rolled her eyes. So is Dad. I heard that. You were meant to. Charles unlocked the front door. The key turned with surprising ease. Inside was cool and dim. Oak beams crossed the ceiling. A grandfather clock ticked solemnly in the hallway. Everything smelled faintly of beeswax and lavender. Felicity clasped her hands together. Oh, Charles, it's perfect. He had to admit she'd been right, worth every penny. 2 glorious weeks away from London's endless noise. No clients, no stock market, no telephone ringing every 5 minutes. Just sea air, silence, peace. Somewhere outside, a church bell rang once. Then after a pause, rang again. Then stopped, almost as though it had changed its mind. The knock at the door came precisely 30 seconds after they'd carried in the final suitcase. Charles opened it. Standing on the step was a stout woman in her early 60s, wearing a flowered dress, sensible shoes, and an immaculate white apron. She carried a wicker basket. Her smile was broad enough to qualify as architecture. You'll be Mr. Ashcombe. I am. I'm Edith Bramble. She offered her hand. Her grip was surprisingly firm. I'm looking after you while you're here. Charles blinked. I'm sorry. The agency, the cleaning, the cooking, the washing. She spoke each word as though gently placing crockery onto a shelf. You did ask for someone. Oh, he had, months ago. He'd forgotten entirely. Mrs. Bramble stepped inside without appearing to enter. Somehow she simply became part of the house. I brought you a pie. She handed over the basket. It seemed neighbourly. The aroma escaping beneath the cloth nearly caused Charles to forgive every tax increase introduced since 1979. My word! Steak and ale, local beef, bit of Yorkshire in every bite. Felicity appeared behind him. How lovely! Mrs. Bramble smiled. You'll not go hungry here. Something about the way she said it made Victoria glance up from the hallway. The words sounded less like reassurance, more like certainty. Within 15 minutes, Mrs. Bramble knew everyone's name, and within 20, she knew how each of them took their tea. Charles was almost certain he hadn't told her. She wandered through the cottage with cheerful efficiency. Larder, cellar, hot water's a touch temperamental, 3rd stair creaks. Don't worry about that, she pointed casually towards the sitting room. I've turned the mirror round. Felicity looked puzzled. Why? Oh, Mrs. Bramble adjusted a vase by less than an inch. "It catches the evening light." There was the tiniest pause. "And we don't like the evening looking back." Then she laughed, a warm grandmotherly laugh. Everyone joined in, even though nobody was entirely sure what the joke had been. That evening they walked into the village. Children played cricket in the square, and the publican waved from outside the black gull. An elderly woman watering roses wished them a pleasant stay before they'd spoken. The butcher called out cheerfully, "The London family's arrived then." Charles smiled politely. "I suppose word travels quickly." The butcher chuckled. "It never really has far to go." As dusk settled over Gulls End, the village seemed to grow quieter rather than busier. Curtains closed, doors shut. One by one the fishing boats returned. Every single one. Oliver noticed first. "Dad, what is it? They all came back." "I should hope so." "No," Oliver counted again. "There were 12. There are still 12. Charles smiled. "That's generally how fishing works." Oliver wasn't convinced. "I never saw one leave." Before Charles could answer, a low horn echoed somewhere out beyond the cliffs. Not loud, not threatening, just deep. The villagers stopped where they were. Every conversation ended for perhaps 5 seconds. The entire village listened. Then everyone carried on exactly as before. Charles frowned. What was that? The butcher had already gone back inside. The woman with the roses suddenly found another flower to water. Only Mrs. Bramble answered. She appeared beside them so quietly none of them had noticed. "Oh," she looked out towards the darkening sea, "that's just the tide." Charles laughed. "The tide has a horn?" Mrs. Bramble smiled, the same warm smile she'd worn all afternoon. "It does here." She turned towards the cottage. "Best be getting home. We don't wander after dark." Victoria smirked. "What happens if you do?" Mrs. Bramble looked at her kindly. "You'll meet someone. They're terribly welcoming." She walked away before anyone could ask another question. The family watched her disappear into the gathering dusk. For reasons none of them could quite explain, the holiday suddenly didn't feel quite so relaxing anymore. Far out at sea, hidden beyond the last light of the sinking sun, something answered the horn, and something in the village listened. Chapter 2. Sunday, the 20th of July, 1986. Charles Ashcombe awoke to silence. Not the London silence, which was really just traffic pretending to rest. This was something else. No engines, no aircraft, no distant sirens, only the relentless sigh of the sea. For a glorious 30 seconds, he wondered if retiring early might not be such a terrible idea. Then he remembered he was 46, had 2 children to educate, a mortgage the size of Luxembourg, and a boss who believed holidays were merely opportunities to answer letters somewhere more picturesque. Reality returned with all the grace of a tax inspector. Downstairs, the smell of bacon drifted through the cottage. Charles frowned. He distinctly remembered not buying any. He followed the scent into the kitchen. Mrs. Bramble stood at the range, humming softly to herself. The table was already laid. Bacon, eggs, black pudding, fried bread, tomatoes, mushrooms, toast, marmalade, a silver pot of tea. It looked less like breakfast and more like an edible declaration of war. Charles blinked. "I say," Mrs. Bramble smiled. "Morning, Mr. Ashcombe. I don't remember arranging breakfast." "No, you wouldn't," she carried on, turning sausages. "I did." Victoria wandered in, wearing an oversized Duran Duran t-shirt. She stared at the feast. "Who's died?" Mrs. Bramble laughed. "No one, dear." "Shame." Charles looked over his newspaper. "Victoria, what? If this is Yorkshire hospitality, we're going to need bigger trousers by August." Mrs. Bramble nodded approvingly. "That's usually how it starts." Again that tiny pause, that peculiar choice of words. Nobody mentioned it. Oliver was already outside. He'd discovered a narrow path behind the cottage, leading towards the cliffs, and had returned 20 minutes later with muddy trainers and a pocket full of unusual stones. "I found footprints." Charles buttered another slice of toast. "On a footpath? They were strange." "How?" Oliver hesitated. "They looked backwards." Victoria snorted into her tea. "You mean someone was walking the other way?" "No, they weren't." Mrs. Bramble stopped stirring the porridge, just for a heartbeat, then continued. "You'll find all sorts in the cliffs." She never looked up. "But don't follow the footprints. That leads towards the sea." Oliver frowned. "Why not?" "Because," she smiled, "they're rarely in a hurry coming back." The village was busier than yesterday. Church bells echoed between the cottages. Families in their Sunday best wandered towards a squat stone church perched above the harbour. Its weather vane wasn't a cockerel, it was a fish. Charles pointed. "That's unusual." Mrs. Bramble followed his gaze. "Is it? I've never seen one. We've never needed a cockerel." She said it as though that explained everything. Apparently to her it did. The church itself was beautiful. Ancient oak pews, whitewashed walls, a carved wooden ceiling blackened by centuries of candle smoke. Only one thing struck Felicity as odd. There wasn't a single stained glass window showing saints. Instead, they depicted fishing boats, storms, stars, the moon, the sea, always the sea. The vicar, Reverend Matthew Crowther, was a cheerful man in his 70s, with twinkling eyes and a voice that could probably calm riots. He welcomed the Ashcombe family personally. "London, I hear." Charles smiled. "We've become local news." "Oh no," the vicar chuckled. "You became local history yesterday." The service was entirely ordinary, almost. The hymns were unfamiliar, the prayers slightly unusual. There was no mention of heaven or hell, only gratitude for calm seas, safe returns, and promises kept. Charles assumed it was a fishing community tradition. He thought nothing more of it. Victoria thought rather more. She nudged Oliver. "Notice anything?" The old lady in front? No, she hasn't blinked once. Oliver looked. The old woman smiled pleasantly, still not blinking. He decided perhaps Victoria was winding him up. Probably. After church, the entire village gathered in the square. Trestle tables groaned beneath homemade cakes. Children chased each other between bunting. Some played the fiddle. Someone else handed Charles a pint before he asked. I haven't paid. The barman looked horrified. You don't pay today. Why not? It's Welcome Sunday. Welcome to what? The man laughed. Exactly. Everyone nearby laughed too. A little longer than the joke deserved. Oliver disappeared with a group of local boys. When Charles finally found him an hour later, they were standing near the harbour wall, staring out towards the sea. What are you lot looking at? One of the boys answered, The 13th boat. Charles looked across the harbour. There were only 12. I only count 12. The boys exchanged glances. One shrugged. You always do. And they wandered away before Charles could ask another question. Later that afternoon, Victoria escaped the family picnic and climbed the narrow lane towards the cliffs. She needed music and distance, and at least half an hour without Oliver asking if she wanted to look at another interesting rock. She sat on a weathered bench overlooking the bay. Someone had carved initials into the wood, dozens of them, some fresh, most decades old. And she noticed something peculiar. None of them had dates later than 1956. Not one. She frowned. Surely people still carved initials into benches, didn't they? A voice behind her made a jump. They stopped after that. An old fisherman stood nearby carrying lobster pots. His beard was the colour of sea foam. What stopped? Leaving marks. Why? He looked out across the sea. The sea remembers names. Victoria laughed uncertainly. That's a bit dramatic. Aye, it is, he smiled. But that's the trouble with truth. It rarely has a sense of proportion. He walked away before she could ask what he meant. That evening, a thick sea mist rolled in. It swallowed the harbour, the cliffs, even the cottages opposite, vanishing behind a wall of white. Mrs. Bramble closed every curtain, locked every door, and checked every window. It's only fog, Charles said. She nodded. It usually is. Usually? She ignored the question. Instead, she placed a small loaf of bread on the kitchen windowsill. Oliver watched her. What's that for? The birds. It's night time. I know. They won't eat it. No. Mrs. Bramble looked towards the hidden sea. It isn't for the birds. Before anyone could ask another question, 3 slow knocks echoed against the front door. Knock, knock, knock. Charles stood. I'll get it. Mrs. Bramble's voice cracked across the room with surprising force. No. Everyone froze. The old woman had gone pale. For the first time since they'd met her, she looked frightened. She recovered herself almost immediately, smoothed her apron, and smiled. If someone's expected, they come to the back door. Another 3 knocks, slower this time. Knock, knock, knock. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. After nearly a minute, the knocking stopped. Mrs. Bramble waited another full 60 seconds before quietly drawing the bolt across the door for a second time. Only then did she whisper almost to herself, "They've started early this year." Outside, hidden by the fog, something heavy shuffled slowly past the cottage. It did not try the back door. It already knew who was inside. Chapter 3. Monday, the 21st of July, 1986. The following morning, nobody mentioned the knocking. It simply wasn't done. Like discussing money at the dinner table, asking a lady her age, or admitting you voted for the wrong person. Some subjects were quietly folded away and placed on a shelf marked "Best Left Alone." Charles, naturally, was the first to take it down again. Over breakfast, he buttered a slice of toast and said, as casually as if discussing the weather, "So." Mrs. Bramble looked up from the Argo. "So, who was at the door last night?" Mrs. Bramble spooned marmalade into a crystal dish. "No one." "There was definitely someone." "There was definitely knocking." "Well," Charles smiled, "that's generally caused by someone." Mrs. Bramble considered this. "Not always." Victoria lowered her newspaper. "I like her." The Yorkshire weather had made one of its famous decisions overnight. Yesterday had been glorious. Today looked like Noah ought to be checking timber prices. Rain lashed the cottage. The windows were in great silver sheets. The sea had disappeared entirely. Oliver stood staring through the glass. "It feels strange." Charles looked over his copy of the Daily Telegraph. "It's called rain." "No," Oliver frowned. "It feels like something's waiting." Victoria didn't even glance up from her magazine. Ugh, puberty. By mid-morning, the rain eased enough for Charles to venture into the village. "I need a newspaper." "You've got one," Felicity said. "Today's." "You've got today's." "I mean tomorrow's." She stared at him. He sighed. "I'm already behind." "You've been on holiday for 2 days." "Exactly." The village shop appeared to sell everything. Bread, milk, fishing tackle, postcards, coal, buckets, shovels, 2 shelves of tin peaches, exactly 1 television aerial, and a glass cabinet containing 3 jars, labelled simply, "Do not open." Charles pointed. "What are those?" The shopkeeper glanced over. "Oh, those. Yes. What are they?" The man smiled. "My wife says curiosity keeps you young, and I buried her last October." "Still curious?" Charles laughed politely. He wasn't entirely sure that had been a joke. Outside the shop, 3 elderly ladies watched him with open interest. Not unfriendly, simply observant. He tipped his hat. "Morning." One smiled. "You've polished your shoes." Charles looked down. "I generally do." "You'll stop." "Will I?" "Oh, yes." The second lady nodded. "Nobody bothers after a while." Charles smiled. "I imagine I shall." The third lady patted his arm. "They all say that." Meanwhile, Oliver had discovered the harbour. The tide was out, farther out than he'd ever seen before. Boats rested awkwardly on the wet sand. Crabs scuttled between rock pools. He wandered after them until he heard someone whistle, a sharp, urgent sound. An old fisherman waved frantically from the harbour wall. Back! Oliver turned around. Me? Aye, now! Confused, Oliver jogged back. What is it? The old man looked pale. You were past the marker. What marker? The fisherman pointed. A row of weathered wooden posts disappeared across the beach. Each was carved with a single symbol. Not words, just circles intersected by crooked lines. I didn't notice them. That's because visitors never do. Oliver laughed nervously. What happens if I walk beyond them? The fisherman didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked out across the exposed seabed. You ever notice how the sea never gives back anchors? Oliver blinked. What? The fisherman nodded once. Exactly. Then he walked away. Back at the cottage, Felicity had become thoroughly enchanted by Mrs. Bramble. I simply must have your scone recipe. Mrs. Bramble smiled. Family secret? Oh, go on. I couldn't. I won't tell a soul. Mrs. Bramble looked genuinely horrified. My dear, that's exactly what gets people into trouble. Victoria had escaped upstairs with a Walkman and a battered copy of The Woman in Black. The irony was not lost on her. She'd just reached the genuinely frightening bit when the cassette player clicked. The batteries had died. Typical. She pulled off the headphones. Silence. Not quite. There it was again. A faint singing. Children, somewhere outside. She crossed to the bedroom window. The lane below was empty. The singing continued. Soft, slow, almost carried on the wind. Keep the promise, keep the tide, keep them safely, all inside. Victoria frowned. She leaned farther out, and the singing stopped instantly, as if someone had cut a wire. The lane remained empty. Then, from somewhere below her, a little girl's voice. You shouldn't look from upstairs. Victoria jumped so violently she nearly dropped her Walkman. A child of about 8 stood beside the front gate. She wore a yellow raincoat despite the sunshine that had suddenly broken through the clouds. Excuse me? The little girl smiled sweetly. My gran says you shouldn't look out upstairs. Why not? The girl shrugged. So they don't see you first. Before Victoria could reply, another woman called from farther up the lane. Eleanor! The child skipped away. Halfway up the hill she turned and waved, then disappeared behind a cottage. Victoria hurried downstairs. Mom! Felicity looked up from arranging flowers. What is it? There was a little girl outside. Yes? She said something weird. Mrs. Bramble froze. What was her name? I don't know. She had a yellow coat, brown hair. Mrs. Bramble's face lost all its colour. Did she say Eleanor? Victoria frowned. Yes. Why? Mrs. Bramble looked towards the window. Very quietly she said, because Eleanor's been dead for 23 years. Silence settled over the kitchen. Charles burst in, carrying a paper bag from the bakery. You'll never guess. Nobody answered. The baker gave me 6 doughnuts. I only paid for 4. Mrs. Bramble slowly turned towards him. What did he say? Charles laughed. He said, his smile faded, he said I'd settle the difference before summer was over. No one laughed, not even Victoria. Outside the church bell rang, once, twice, then 13 times. Charles frowned. That's odd. Mrs. Bramble closed her eyes. No, she whispered. That's impossible. High above the village, unseen amongst the mist, wrapped cliffs, something had begun to count, and this time it had reached 13. Chapter 4. Tuesday, the 22nd of July, 1986. By Tuesday morning, Charles Ashcombe had reached a conclusion. The people of Gulls End were perfectly pleasant, perfectly polite, perfectly helpful, and absolutely barking. He said as much over breakfast. Mrs. Bramble was serving kippers. Nobody had asked for kippers. Nobody had even hinted at wanting kippers. They simply appeared, as they did every morning, in portions generous enough to satisfy a regiment. I've decided, Charles announced cautiously, removing a fishbone from his toast, that the entire village has taken leave of its collective senses. Mrs. Bramble poured tea. We've never had much use for collective thinking. Victoria grinned. I told you I liked her. Charles pointed his knife towards the ceiling. I met a man yesterday who implied the sea steals anchors. Oliver swallowed a mouthful of toast. It does. Charles sighed. No, Oliver. People lose anchors. Mrs. Bramble stirred her tea. Sometimes. There it is again. Charles leaned back in his chair. Sometimes. Nobody in this village ever answers a question properly. Mrs. Bramble looked genuinely puzzled. Of course we do. No, you don't. You just stop halfway through. She smiled. Only when the rest would spoil the surprise. After breakfast, Felicity decided they needed a family photograph. A proper one. Charles looked horrified. We've only been here 3 days. Exactly. Everyone still looks presentable. Victoria groaned. Mom, it'll take 5 minutes. That's what you said when we had those Christmas portraits. It did only take 5 minutes. Yes. It was the waiting for the photographer that lasted 3 hours. The village photographer occupied a tiny shop overlooking the harbour. Its faded sign read, H. Dobson, Portraits, Weddings and Memories. Charles frowned. Odd thing to advertise. Inside, clocks ticked in every corner. Not one of them agreed on the time. The photographer himself emerged from behind a velvet curtain. He was a thin man, with silver hair and spectacles thick enough to qualify as defensive equipment. Morning. You'll be wanting a holiday portrait. Felicity beamed. Yes, please. Mr. Dobson hesitated. All of you? Charles laughed. I should hope so. Another pause. Very good. The sitting room at the back of the shop was filled with framed photographs. Holiday makers, wedding parties, fishing crews, school children. Charles wandered over while the camera was being prepared. Something felt odd. Every photograph contained one tiny similarity. Every single person was smiling. Not broadly, not happily, just enough, as though they'd all been told exactly how much happiness was appropriate. Then he noticed something else. The clothes. Some photographs were early Victorian, others looked Edwardian, some from the 1950s, one from only a few years ago. Yet the background never changed. The wallpaper, the curtains, even the vase of flowers, exactly the same. Over 100 years? Funny. Mr. Dobson appeared, silently beside him. What is? You never redecorated. The old man smiled. We've never needed to. Charles laughed. Fair enough. Mr. Dobson didn't. The photograph itself took less than a minute. Stand together, a little closer. Oh, excellent. The flash exploded. For a fraction of a second, Victoria could have sworn there was someone standing behind the camera. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing what looked like an old-fashioned oilskin coat. Then the room returned to normal. She glanced around. Nobody, just Mr. Dobson adjusting the lens. You all right, dear? He asked. I thought... No, he smiled kindly. You didn't. As they left, Mr. Dobson called after them. Your photograph will be ready in a fortnight. Charles turned. We'll have gone by then. The photographer tilted his head. We'll see. That afternoon Oliver found the smuggler's tunnel, quite by accident, or so he thought. The entrance was hidden behind a curtain of ivy below the cliffs, barely wide enough to squeeze through. Cool air drifted from the darkness beyond. He grinned. This is brilliant, isn't it? Oliver spun round. An elderly man sat on a rock nearby, mending a lobster pot. Oliver was certain he hadn't been there a moment earlier. Does it go far? Oh, yes. Where does it come out? The old fisherman threaded another piece of rope through the net. Depends. On what? Who's asking? Oliver peered into the darkness. Can I explore it? I wouldn't. Why not? The fisherman looked towards the sea. It remembers footsteps. Oliver frowned. Everyone keeps saying things like that. The old man nodded. Aye, we've had a lot of practice. Inside the tunnel, the air smelled of salt and damp stone. Water dripped steadily somewhere ahead. Oliver switched on his torch. The beam danced over rough walls, old timbers, rusty hooks. Someone had carved names into the rock. Hundreds of names, some recent, some ancient. He ran his fingers over them, then stopped. One name looked new. Ashcombe. Oliver stared. Impossible! Someone had scratched it into the stone. Fresh, sharp, as though it had only been carved yesterday. Below it were 4 initials. CFVO. Exactly where each member of his family would stand. He backed away. No! The torch flickered, then went out. Behind him, footsteps. Slow, measured, not coming towards him, walking deeper into the tunnel, as though inviting him to follow. Oliver held his breath. Hello? Nothing. Only dripping water. Then very softly, a voice. You've come back. Oliver ran. He didn't stop until he burst into daylight. Breathless and white-faced, the old fisherman was gone. There was no sign anyone had ever been there. That evening Charles returned from the pub, looking unusually thoughtful. Felicity noticed immediately. Everything all right? You've only had 1 pint. I know. Feeling ill? No. He hesitated. I had the strangest conversation. With? The landlord. What about? Charles shrugged. I mentioned we'd probably visit Whitby tomorrow, and he looked disappointed. So, he said. Charles frowned, trying to remember the exact words. People always think they have more time than they do. Mrs. Bramble, who had been peeling potatoes, stopped. The knife hovered in mid-air. Did he? Charles nodded. Rather odd thing to say. Mrs. Bramble quietly set the knife down. Mr. Ashcombe? The first time since they met her voice carried not warmth but urgency. I need you to promise me something. What is it? If anyone in the village invites you anywhere, she looked at each member of the family in turn. Don't accept. Charles chuckled. Edith, we're hardly going to wander into some secret cult meeting. Mrs. Bramble didn't smile. I'm serious. Victoria noticed something she had never seen before. Mrs. Bramble's hands were shaking. At that very moment, someone knocked gently at the front door. Not 3 knocks this time, just one. Polite, patient. Mrs. Bramble closed her eyes. There, she whispered. They've begun. Charles opened the door before anyone could stop him. Standing on the doorstep was the Reverend Matthew Crowther. He smiled as warmly as ever. Good evening, Mr. Ashcombe. Charles smiled back. Vicar, what can we do for you? The Reverend removed his cap. I've come to invite your family. He glanced past Charles, meeting Mrs. Bramble's frightened eyes for just a fraction of a second. To our Founders' Day celebration this Saturday. The silence settled over the hallway. Mrs. Bramble looked as though every drop of blood had drained from her face. Charles, oblivious, beamed. That sounds delightful. Behind him, so quietly that only Victoria heard it, Mrs. Bramble whispered to herself, They're 6 days early. The Reverend's smile never faltered. Outside, beyond the cottage, the sea was calm, far too calm, as if it too was waiting for Saturday. Chapter 5. Wednesday, the 23rd of July, 1986. Charles Ashcombe had always believed there were only 2 kinds of invitation, the sort you accepted and the sort you invented influenza to avoid. He had yet to discover there was a third, the sort everyone expected you to accept, especially if saying no was never really an option. Breakfast was quieter than usual. Even the bacon seemed subdued. Mrs. Bramble moved around the kitchen with her customary efficiency, but the cheerful commentary that normally accompanied every frying pan and teapot had vanished. Oliver noticed first. You're not humming. Mrs. Bramble looked up. Am I not? You always hum. I expect I've run out of tunes. Victoria glanced at her. No, you've run out of pretending. Mrs. Bramble's hand paused over the teapot. For the briefest moment, her eyes met Victoria's. There was gratitude there, and something dangerously close to fear. Charles unfolded the morning newspaper. Right, I've made a decision. Victoria sighed theatrically. Should we all sit down? We are sitting down. Oh, so we are. Charles ignored her. We're driving to Whitby today. Mrs. Bramble closed the oven door rather harder than intended. The bang echoed through the cottage. You can't. Charles looked up. Can't? I mean, she forced a smile. The road's terribly busy in summer. I've driven in London. Exactly. I've survived Hyde Park Corner. The North Yorkshire roads aren't Hyde Park Corner. No, Mrs. Bramble said quietly. They're older. Half an hour later, the Granada was packed. Picnic hamper, blankets, Victoria's Walkman, Oliver's rucksack full of entirely unnecessary equipment. Charles turned the ignition. The engine coughed once, twice, then died. He frowned. Oh, tut. He tried again. Nothing. Again. Silence. Mrs. Bramble watched from the cottage doorway. I'll fetch Mr. Fletcher. The mechanic? She nodded. He'll know. Mr. Albert Fletcher arrived carrying a toolbox that looked as though it was repaired both world wars. He lifted the bonnet, peered inside, tapped something with a spanner and listened, then shut the bonnet again. Charles waited. Well? Mr. Fletcher removed his flat cap. It's not poorly. No, it just isn't going. Charles stared at him. I'd gathered that. The mechanic nodded thoughtfully. It'll go tomorrow. How do you know? It always does. Charles folded his arms. You're telling me my car has chosen not to work today? Aye. It happens. Why? Mr. Fletcher looked towards the sea. Doesn't like Wednesdays. Charles laughed. Mr. Fletcher didn't. By lunchtime, the entire village seemed aware that Ashcombs had attempted to leave. The butcher waved cheerfully as Charles passed. Maybe tomorrow. The baker smiled. No rush. The postmistress added, You've plenty of time. Charles muttered under his breath. They keep saying that. Victoria walked beside him. Maybe they all went to the same finishing school. For what? Creepy remarks. The village square was alive with activity. Bunting stretched between cottages. Children painted wooden signs. Women arranged flowers. Around the old stone cross, men erected a large wooden platform outside the church. Charles smiled. Looks like quite the fete. An elderly gentleman overheard him. Oh no, it isn't a fete. What is it then? The old man frowned as if searching for the correct word. It's, he smiled again, a remembering. Oliver wandered over to watch several fishermen decorating a small boat with ribbons. Not a fishing boat, far too ornate. Its hull had been freshly painted white. The name across the bow read, "The Mercy of the Tides." One of the fishermen noticed him looking. "Pretty, isn't she?" Oliver nodded. "Is she new?" The man's smile faded. "No, very old." "How old?" "We repaint her every 30 years." "Why?" The fisherman tied another ribbon. "So she always looks welcoming." Victoria had escaped to the bookshop. It consisted of one room, half books, half dust. The owner, Miss Havers, wore enormous spectacles on a chain and regarded every customer as though they might fold a page. Victoria wandered through shelves of local history, fishing, smuggling, ghosts. She pulled down a thick volume, "The History of Gulls End." Most of the pages had been cut out, not torn, neatly removed. Only the chapter titles remained. She frowned. "Excuse me?" Miss Havers appeared, silently. "Yes, dear." "Has someone vandalized this?" The old woman looked at the book. "No, it was published like that." Victoria blinked. "Why?" "The council insisted." "What was missing?" Miss Havers smiled pleasantly. "The interesting bits." On the way home, Victoria noticed Mr. Dobson's photography shop. A handwritten sign now hung in the window. "Ashcombe Family, portrait ready for collection." She stopped dead. That wasn't possible. He said a fortnight yesterday. She pushed open the door. The bell jingled. Mr. Dobson appeared almost instantly. "I thought you might come." Victoria looked at the envelope. "You've already finished it?" "Oh, yes. I was inspired." She opened it. The photograph was beautiful, almost. The four of them stood exactly as she remembered. Charles smiling confidently, Felicity elegant as ever, Oliver trying not to fidget, and Victoria looking faintly bored. But behind them, barely visible in the flash, stood dozens of villagers, watching, smiling. They hadn't been there yesterday. She was certain of it. "I think," Victoria swallowed, "you developed the wrong negative." Mr. Dobson adjusted his spectacles. "No, I developed the only one there was." She looked again. Right at the back, almost hidden in the shadows, stood Mrs. Bramble. Unlike everyone else, she wasn't smiling, she was crying. That evening the rain returned. Not heavy, just enough to blur the windows. Mrs. Bramble served shepherd's pie. Nobody spoke much. Finally Charles pushed away his plate. "Edith?" She looked up. "Yes? I'm beginning to think there's something odd about this village." Victoria nearly choked on her water. "You've only just noticed?" "I mean genuinely odd." Mrs. Bramble folded her napkin. "There are old places all over England, Mr. Ashcombe. They have traditions, they have stories, they have ways of doing things." Charles nodded. "I know, but this feels," he searched for the word, "staged." Mrs. Bramble's expression softened. "You're not wrong." Silence settled over the table. Then very quietly she said, "Do you know why people believe traditions?" Charles shook his head. "Because somewhere, long ago, someone survived by following one." Nobody had an answer to that. Just before bedtime, Oliver realised he'd left his torch in the garden. Ignoring Victoria's warning that the garden isn't going anywhere, he slipped outside. The air was strangely warm. The rain had stopped. Mist drifted lazily between the cottages. He found the torch beside the old stone wall. As he picked it up, he heard voices, not close, far below, down on the beach. Dozens of voices, singing, not loudly, softly, like a lullaby. Oliver crept to the top of the cliff path. The tide should have been in. Instead, the sea had pulled back farther than ever before. Hundreds of villagers stood in the wet sand, each carrying a lantern. They formed a great circle around something Oliver couldn't see what. Every lantern flame flickered at exactly the same moment. Then every villager turned, not towards the sea, towards him. They were far too distant to have seen him, surely. Yet every face lifted together, every smile appeared together, and carried upwards on the night wind came a single sentence: "There's one awake!" Oliver ran. He didn't stop until he was inside the cottage with the door bolted behind him. Breathless, he looked through the window. The beach was empty. The tide was in. Nothing remained except dark water stretching to the horizon. When he told the others what he'd seen, Charles ruffled his hair. "You've been reading ghost stories again." Oliver wanted to believe him. He really did. But tucked inside his pocket, where he was certain it hadn't been before, was a small white seashell. On its smooth surface, scratched with something sharp, was one word: "Welcome." Chapter 6. Thursday, 24th of July, 1986. There is a particular sort of lie every British family tells. I'm sure it'll all make sense in the morning. It rarely does. By breakfast, Oliver's mysterious seashell had become a family disagreement. Charles insisted one of the village children had slipped it into his pocket as a joke. Victoria thought that was absurd. No one gets close enough to Oliver voluntarily. Very funny. I'm serious. So am I. Felicity turned the shell over in her hand. The word "welcome" had been scratched into it with remarkable precision. It's rather sweet. Victoria stared. Mum, it's creepy. It's a shell. It's a threatening shell. Mrs. Bramble, buttering toast, spoke without looking up. Round here, those are the worst sort. Charles had had enough. I'm driving to Scarborough. The car will start today. Mrs. Bramble said nothing. She simply looked out of the kitchen window. Charles jingled the car keys triumphantly. You see? He marched outside. The family watched from the window. The Granada started instantly. Charles grinned through the windscreen. I told you. He selected first gear. The engine revved. The wheels turned. The car remained exactly where it was. He tried again. The engine roared. Nothing. Mr. Fletcher, who happened to be walking past, carrying a sack of potatoes, stopped to watch. Handbrake? Charles checked. It isn't on. Mr. Fletcher nodded. Didn't think it was. Charles climbed out. What is it then? The mechanic bent down and peered underneath the car and scratched his chin. What? It's grown roots. Charles stared. I'm sorry. Mr. Fletcher smiled pleasantly. It happens to visitors. Then after a thoughtful pause, not often this quickly. Mind. Victoria snorted so hard she nearly fell over laughing. Charles glared. It isn't funny. Oh, it really is. I appear to be trapped in a village where the mechanic believes motor cars are botanical. Mrs. Bramble quietly muttered. He's usually right. Determined not to waste the day, Felicity announced they would explore the cliff path instead. The views will be marvellous. Mrs. Bramble's smile vanished. The west path? Not the east? Why? The west is prettier. Victoria raised an eyebrow. And the real reason? Mrs. Bramble hesitated. And the east path isn't always there. Charles laughed. It's a path. Mrs. Bramble looked at him squarely in the eye. Yes, it is. The west cliff path wound through long grass, sprinkled with buttercups and wild thyme. The sea glittered below like hammered steel. Even Charles had to admit it was magnificent. You see, Felicity smiled, worth coming north. Charles breathed deeply. I haven't smelt diesel for 3 days. Victoria nudged him. Give it time. Halfway along the path they came across a stone well, not marked on the tourist map, not surrounded by railings, just an ancient circle of weathered stone with an iron bucket inside it. The little wooden sign read, Please don't look down. Oliver was delighted. I'm definitely looking down. Mrs. Bramble sighed. I was afraid you'd say that. Charles peered over the edge. The well seemed impossibly deep. No water, only darkness. He picked up a pebble. Dad, Oliver warned. Charles dropped it. They waited. 1 second, 2, 3, nothing. No splash, no echo. Victoria folded her arms. That's not normal. Charles frowned. It must be. Mrs. Bramble quietly crossed herself, only it wasn't the sign of the cross. It was older, slower, almost circular. Shall we move on? She asked. No one argued. They stopped for lunch overlooking the bay. Mrs. Bramble unpacked sandwiches wrapped in greaseproof paper, roast beef, pickle, thick slices of fruit cake, a flask of tea. Yorkshire hospitality refused to acknowledge portion control. Oliver wandered a little way off with his binoculars. He was scanning the harbour when something caught his eyes. A funeral, or what looked like one. Half the village was gathered around a coffin, except they weren't carrying it towards the church. were carrying it towards the beach. Oliver focused the binoculars. The coffin wasn't made of wood. It was woven, like a giant wicker basket. Before he could call anyone over, the procession disappeared behind the cliffs. When he looked again, they had gone. There was nowhere they could have gone. That evening, rain hammered against the cottage windows. The electricity flickered once, twice, then settled. Mrs. Bramble lit candles anyway. We always do. Charles looked up from the crossword. In case of a power cut? In case of the dark? The dark arrives every evening. Yes. It doesn't always arrive alone. Victoria slowly lowered her book. Nobody laughed. Later, unable to sleep, Victoria wandered downstairs for a glass of water. The cottage was silent, except someone was talking very quietly. She followed the sound. It came from the kitchen. Mrs. Bramble was sitting alone at the table. One candle burned beside her. In front of her stood an old photograph. Victoria couldn't see who was in it. Mrs. Bramble was speaking to it. I'm trying. I know what we promised. But they're good people. Then the old woman bowed her head. I can't lose another family. Victoria accidentally stood on the creaking floorboard. Mrs. Bramble spun round. For a heartbeat, her expression was one of pure terror. Then it softened. You should be asleep. Victoria stepped into the kitchen. Who were you talking to? No one. You were? Mrs. Bramble looked at the photograph. She turned it face down, before Victoria could see it. It was my husband. I'm sorry. He died. Mrs. Bramble nodded. A long time ago. In the sea. The old woman looked towards the window. No. The sea kept him. Victoria sat opposite her. You know what's happening here, don't you? Mrs. Bramble closed her eyes. I know enough. Then tell us. I can't. Why not? Because some secrets, she looked up, don't stay secrets once they're spoken aloud. Victoria sighed. That's infuriating. I know. It's why we've lasted so long. Another silence settled between them. Then Mrs. Bramble reached across the table and took Victoria's hand. Her own was ice cold. Listen to me. When Saturday comes, if anyone offers you flowers, don't take them. Why? Because once you accept a gift, you're no longer a guest. Victoria frowned. What do I become? Mrs. Bramble's eyes filled with tears. So terribly welcome. At that exact moment, every candle in the kitchen went out. Not flickered, not dimmed, extinguished. Together the room plunged into darkness. From somewhere beyond the back door came the sound of footsteps crossing the yard. Heavy, deliberate. 1, 2, 3. Then a man's voice, low and calm, drifted through the night. Edith, we know you're awake. Neither woman moved, neither breathed. The voice came again. You've always had a kind heart. But Saturday's coming. The footsteps retreated into the darkness. Only when they had completely faded did Mrs. Bramble whisper, "They've started watching the house." Victoria looked at the old woman. For the first time since arriving in Gulls End, she realised Mrs. Bramble wasn't one of their captors. She was their only ally. Chapter 7, Friday the 25th of July, 1986. By Friday morning, Charles Ashcombe had developed what Felicity described as holiday paranoia. Charles preferred the term heightened observational skills. Victoria preferred finally catching up with the rest of us. Breakfast arrived precisely at 8. Porridge, poached eggs, toast, homemade blackberry jam. Mrs. Bramble placed everything on the table with military precision. Nobody touched a thing. Charles looked around the room. "I've just realised something." Oliver looked up. "What?" "We've been here nearly a week." "Yes, I've never seen a delivery van." Victoria blinked. "What? The butcher, the baker, the grocer, where do they get everything?" Felicity frowned. "I suppose I hadn't noticed." Charles leaned back. "Neither had I. And that's exactly what worries me." Mrs. Bramble quietly poured tea. "The sea provides." Charles sighed. "Everything?" Mrs. Bramble met his eyes eventually. "The post arrived at 9:30, or rather, the postman arrived." Mr. Eric Pollard tipped his cap cheerfully and handed Charles a neat bundle of letters. Charles looked through them all: the electricity bill, bank statement, a letter from his secretary, all perfectly ordinary. Then he frowned. One envelope had no stamp, no postmark, no address. Simply, "For Mr. Ashcombe." Inside was a single folded sheet of paper written in immaculate fountain pen. "You still have time." Nothing else. No signature. Charles looked up. "Who delivered this?" Mr. Pollard smiled pleasantly. "I did." "Who wrote it?" "Couldn't say." "You must know." The postman shrugged. "I only deliver what's posted." "But there isn't a stamp." "There doesn't need to be." "Why?" Mr. Pollard smiled again. "It never leaves the village." After lunch, Victoria decided enough was enough. She was going to investigate properly, not wandering around hoping something creepy happened. Actually investigating. She recruited Oliver immediately. "Excellent!" He emptied his rucksack onto the bed. Torch, compass, Swiss Army knife, magnifying glass, notebook, chocolate biscuits. She stared. "Planning to solve a mystery or invade?" "You never know." Their destination was the church, not the front, the graveyard, because every mystery worth solving eventually involved a cemetery. The churchyard overlooked the sea, enclosed by a low stone wall, bleached white by the salt and wind. Hundreds of gravestones leaned drunkenly against one another. Oliver began reading names aloud. "Thompson, Fletcher, Pollard, Bramble. Half the village is here." Victoria wandered farther. Something caught her eye. the dates. One stone read Alice Fletcher, 1909 to 1986. Another, Joseph Bramble, 1918 to 1986. Another, Mary Pollard, 1931 to 1986. Victoria frowned. That's odd. Oliver looked up. What? They all died this year. So? It's July. Oliver stopped. So? How do they know? More stones everywhere. Death dates already carved. 1986, 1987, 1988, 1989. Some hadn't happened yet. One stone stood slightly apart from the others. New, untouched by the weather. Victoria's stomach tightened. She walked towards it. Oliver followed. The inscription read, Charles Edward Ashcombe, born 1940, no date of death. Just beneath his name, space, blank, waiting. Oliver whispered, We should go. Victoria nodded. Neither of them argued. As they hurried towards the gate, Reverend Crowther appeared carrying fresh flowers. Good afternoon. The children froze. The vicar smiled warmly. Enjoying our church? Victoria forced a smile. Very much. I hope you don't mind. She nodded towards the gravestones. But why are some unfinished? The Reverend looked exactly where she pointed. Ah, family plots. We prepare them in advance. Victoria tried again. They've already carved this year. They're efficient. Stonemasons. He smiled. It saves time later. The children left quickly. The Reverend watched them disappear down the hill. His smile slowly faded. When they were gone, he laid the flowers on Charles Ashcombe's unfinished grave. Then very gently he brushed a little dust from the stone. As planned, he murmured. Back at the cottage, Charles had made a discovery of his own. The telephone was dead. Not unusual in Old Village, except the wires had been cut cleanly recently. He held the cable in his hand. This, he announced to the room, is not folklore. Mrs. Bramble looked at the floor. No, it isn't. You knew. I suspected. Charles rounded on her. Edith, for days you've been speaking in riddles. No more. What is this place? Mrs. Bramble looked exhausted. She glanced towards every window before speaking. Lock the door, Charles did. Draw the curtains, Victoria did. Mrs. Bramble waited. Then she spoke so quietly they had to lean forward to hear. Gulls End wasn't always called Gulls End. Charles frowned. What was it called? Mrs. Bramble closed her eyes. No one says the old name. Why? Because names matter. Victoria interrupted. You said Eleanor was dead. Yes, I saw her. Mrs. Bramble nodded sadly. I know. Oliver swallowed. The graves, the phone, the knocking. What's happening? Mrs. Bramble stood and walked to the old dresser and reached to the very back of the top shelf. Behind stacks of neatly folded tablecloths, she removed an ancient leather-bound journal. The cover bore no title, only a strange symbol, a circle crossed by 13 lines, the same symbol Oliver had seen on the beach. She placed it on the table. It belonged to my grandfather. Charles reached for it. Mrs. Bramble caught his wrist. Once you've read it, you can never unknow it. Charles gave a tired smile. After this week, I don't think ignorance has much to recommend it. She slowly released his hand. The leather creaked as he opened the book. The first page was dated 1649. Written beneath it in faded brown ink were the words, "This book is to be opened only when the sea grows hungry." Charles turned the page. The room suddenly became noticeably colder. Outside, every church bell in Gulls End began ringing. Not in celebration, not for a wedding, not for a funeral, all at once. Their frantic peals echoed across the cliffs. Mrs. Bramble looked towards the window in horror. "No," she whispered. "They know." Charles looked up. "Know what?" She was already bolting the front door. "They know the book has been opened." Across the village, doors opened. Men and women stepped into the streets. Every face turned towards Seafarer's Rest. Not one of them spoke. They simply looked, waiting, watching, as if the cottage itself had just lit a beacon that could not be extinguished. For the first time since arriving in Gulls End, the Ashcombs understood one terrible truth. They were no longer merely being welcomed, they were being hunted. Chapter 8. Friday, the 25th of July, 1986. The Book of the Tide. The church bells stopped as suddenly as they began. The silence that followed was worse. Charles stood in the middle of the kitchen, one hand still resting on the ancient journal. Outside, the village had fallen unnaturally quiet. No children laughed, no dogs barked. Even the gulls seemed to have abandoned Gulls End. Victoria looked towards the window. "They're listening." Mrs. Bramble nodded. "They always do after the bells." Nobody suggested turning on the lights. Mrs. Bramble lit 2 candles instead. "The electricity works," Charles said. "I know." "Then why the candles?" She looked towards the ceiling. "Candlelight belongs to us. The electric belongs to other things." Charles rubbed his forehead. "I've reached the point where I don't even know which questions to ask." Victoria smiled weakly. "Welcome to Yorkshire." Even Mrs. Bramble managed the faintest smile. The journal lay open on the table. Its pages were yellow with age. The ink faded but still legible. Oliver carefully turned the first page. At the top, in beautiful 17th century handwriting, were the words, "July, in the year of our Lord, 1649. Below them, "Should these pages be opened, then God have mercy upon Gulls End, for the sea has grown hungry once again." Charles frowned. "I thought you said the village used to have another name." Mrs. Bramble nodded. "It did." "What was it?" She hesitated. "We don't speak it aloud." "Why?" "The old name belonged to the bargain." "So what was it?" Mrs. Bramble whispered. "Ravenswyke." The candle flame flickered violently. No windows were open. Mrs. Bramble immediately crossed herself, only it wasn't quite the sign of the cross. It was older, far older. Charles continued reading. The winter before the bargain was the cruelest any living soul remembered. The seas swallowed our boats, the crops failed beneath salt, the children died with empty bellies. Then from beneath the eastern cliffs came a voice without words. It offered us life. One family every 30 years, given freely. In return, no child of Ravenswyke would know famine, and no storm would claim the fishermen of the village. Our elders accepted. Oliver swallowed. They actually agreed? Mrs. Bramble answered quietly. They were burying children every week. Charles closed his eyes. What would you have done? Nobody answered. The next pages recorded each offering, not every year, only the summers when payment fell due. Charles turned another page. The entries were not annual, and they appeared only once, every 30 years. Each was written in a different hand, by a different keeper of the journal. Each entry was shorter than the last, as though with every generation the villagers had become less willing to record what they had done. Charles ran his finger down the page. 1649. The covenant is made. 1679. The sea is satisfied. 1709. The harvest is plentiful. 1739. The boats return safely. 1769. The children live. 1799. The bargain is honoured. 1829. The tide keeps its promise. 1859. Another family is welcomed. 1889. The offering is accepted. 1919. The village is spared. 1949. The covenant endures for another 30 years. The next page was written in different ink, not faded brown, blue, modern. At the top of the page was a single date, July 1979. Mrs. Bramble lowered her eyes. Charles read aloud. This was the summer of failure. The appointed family escaped before Founder's Night. The offering was not made. Before dawn, the sea claimed 13 souls from Gulls End. Fathers, mothers, children. The covenant has been broken. He turned the page. Only one paragraph had been written beneath. The sea has shown mercy we do not deserve. We are granted 7 years to make amends. Before the 7th summer ends, another family must be offered freely. Should we fail again, the covenant shall end forever, and Gulls End will belong to the sea. The final page was almost new. The ink had barely dried. At the top, in Mrs. Bramble's unmistakable handwriting, were the words, July 1986. The 7th summer has come. Another family from London has arrived. They are good people. God forgive us. I do not know if I can let this happen again. Each entry was brief. A family arrived. The village prospered. The sea remained calm. No details, only names. Charles frowned. It's like an accounts book. Mrs. Bramble nodded sadly. That's exactly what it's become. Then the handwriting changed. The ink was newer. The date at the top of the page read July 1979. Mrs. Bramble lowered her head. Charles read aloud. This was a summer of failure. The appointed family fled before Founder's Night. The offering was broken. The sea did not forgive us. The next lines had clearly been written with trembling hands. Before dawn, 13 souls walked into the mist. None returned. The sea accepted its own choosing. It has granted us but 7 years. On the 7th summer, another offering must be made. Should we fail again, the sentence stopped. The ink had splashed across the page. Charles turned it over. The final line continued on the next sheet. There shall be no Gulls End. Silence settled over the kitchen. Even Charles had no sarcastic remark. Mrs. Bramble spoke without looking at them. My daughter was one of the 13. Felicity reached across the table and gently took her hand. My grandson, another pause. My son-in-law. Oliver whispered, I'm sorry. Mrs. Bramble smiled sadly. So was the village. Charles stared at the diary. So, that's why this is happening now. Mrs. Bramble nodded. Yes. The next offering wasn't due until 2009. But the bargain was broken. The sea gave us 7 years. And tomorrow? She couldn't finish the sentence. Victoria did. The 7 years are over. Mrs. Bramble simply nodded. Charles pushed back his chair. No! I don't care if this thing lives under the cliffs or Buckingham Palace. I'm taking my family out of here. Mrs. Bramble looked at him with heartbreaking kindness. So did the family in 1979. Charles opened his mouth and closed it again. Oliver continued reading. Near the back of the journal was a fresh page. The handwriting was unmistakably Mrs. Bramble's, dated only 3 days earlier. The new family have arrived. They laugh together. The father hides his kindness beneath grumbling. The mother reminds me of my Eleanor. The girl notices everything. The boy still believes people are mostly good. Lord forgives me. I cannot watch another family walk to the cliffs. Victoria looked at her. You wrote this? Mrs. Bramble nodded. I shouldn't have, but I had to tell someone. Charles slowly closed the journal. There has to be another way. There isn't. There must be. There wasn't for my family. Her voice cracked. There wasn't for any of them. A single knock sounded at the front door. Not loud, not threatening, almost polite. Nobody moved. Then came Reverend Crowther's familiar voice. Good afternoon, Edith. We brought gifts for our visitors. Mrs. Bramble whispered, Don't answer. Another cheerful voice joined him. The baker. Fresh bread. Then the butcher. And a lovely ham. Then Mrs. Pollard from the post office. Flowers from the church garden. Felicity cautiously eased the curtains aside. The entire lane was filled with villagers, every one of them smiling, everyone holding a gift. Cakes, fruit, wine, flowers, homemade preserves. A welcome fit for royalty. Charles frowned. They're acting as though we'd just arrived. Mrs. Bramble's face drained of colour. They're asking you to accept the village. What happens if we do? You become one of us. And if we don't? Mrs. Bramble looked towards the door. They stop asking politely. The Reverend knocked once more. Mr. Ashcombe, his voice was as warm as ever. We know you've had quite a surprise today. I hope you'll remember we're only trying to protect our home. Charles felt a chill run through him, not because of what the vicar had said, because for the first time he believed him. Outside, every villager stood silently waiting, not with hatred, not with anger, with hope. Hope that one family from London might save every child in Gulls End. Inside the cottage, the Ashcombes looked at one another. No one knew what to say. Then, from somewhere beneath the kitchen floor, came the unmistakable sound of water. Not dripping, flowing, as though a tide had begun to rise beneath the house itself. Mrs. Bramble closed her eyes. "It knows," Charles whispered. "What knows?" She looked towards the ancient floorboards. "The sea. It knows you've read the book." The water continued to rise beneath the cottage, slowly, patiently, like something climbing the stairs. Chapter 9. Friday, 25th of July, 1986. No one moved. The journal lay closed on the kitchen table. Outside, the villagers were still waiting, not impatiently, patiently. That was somehow far worse. Charles had dealt with hostile board meetings, aggressive takeovers, and one particularly unpleasant tax inspector from Croydon. None of them had ever stood outside his front door smiling. "I preferred it when I thought they were simply odd," he muttered. Victoria looked through the narrow gap in the curtains. "They're still there." "How many of them?" "All of them." Charles frowned. "The whole village?" She nodded. "I think so." Oliver swallowed. "Who's looking after the shop?" Even Mrs. Bramble laughed. It was only for a second, but everyone needed it. Felicity was the first to break the silence. "There has to be someone we can trust." Mrs. Bramble looked at her sadly. "I do trust them." They all turned towards her. "What?" "They're good people. They really are." Victoria stared. "They're planning to sacrifice us." Mrs. Bramble nodded. "Because they believe they'll lose everything if they don't." She folded her hands in her lap. "They prisoned my children. They buried my husband. They sat with me when my grandson disappeared. They're my neighbours." Her voice became barely audible. "And tomorrow they'll expect me to help. And tomorrow they'll expect me to help kill your family." No one knew what to say. Charles stood. "We're leaving." Victoria looked at him. "The car?" "I'll walk." "It's nearly 20 miles to Whitby." "I'll crawl if I have to." Mrs. Bramble shook her head. "They'll be watching every road." "Then the cliffs." "They'll expect that too." "The beach?" "The tide belongs to them." Charles sighed. "I notice every route ends rather badly." "Yes," Mrs. Bramble replied quietly. "It usually does." Oliver wandered to the kitchen window. He wasn't looking outside. He was looking down. "Bramble?" Mrs. Bramble smiled faintly. You can call me Edith, love. Edith? The water? Everyone crowded around. Between the cracks in the old flagstones, tiny streams of seawater were bubbling upwards. Not much, just enough to leave a thin silver lines across the floor. Charles touched one with his finger. Salt. Cold. Very cold. We're nowhere near the beach, Mrs. Bramble whispered. It never comes this early. The knock at the front door came again. Gentle, measured. Reverend Crowther's voice followed. Mr. Ashcombe, we've left your gifts on the doorstep. We do hope you'll enjoy them. Footsteps slowly retreated one by one, and silence returned. Victoria waited. They've gone. Mrs. Bramble didn't move. Wait. For what? They'll never all leave. 10 minutes later, Charles carefully opened the front door. The lane was empty. On the doorstep stood half a dozen baskets. Fresh bread, a fruit cake, flowers, a bottle of homemade elderflower wine, a neatly wrapped parcel. Oliver reached for it. Mrs. Bramble almost shouted no. He froze. What? Don't bring anything inside. Charles frowned. It's only food. Mrs. Bramble picked up the loaf of bread with the fire tongs. She carried it to the stone beside the garden, and very gently she placed it there. Nothing happened. Charles smiled. You see? Mrs. Bramble nodded. Now watch. A single black crow landed beside the loaf. It pecked once, then flew away. The bread remained untouched, except where the bird had pecked. The crust had turned black as coal. Felicity stared. It was fresh 5 seconds ago. Mrs. Bramble quietly said, Nothing given freely by the village is ever free. That afternoon the rain finally stopped. The village looked almost cheerful. Children skipped rope. Someone painted bunting outside the church. A brass band rehearsed in the square. If you didn't know better, it looked as though everyone was preparing for the village fete. Victoria watched from an upstairs window. They're practicing. Mrs. Bramble looked up sharply. I told you not to look out upstairs. I forgot. Mrs. Bramble hurried across the room and gently pulled her away from the glass. You mustn't. Why? Because they can tell. Who? Mrs. Bramble hesitated. Then, for the first time, she answered directly. The watchers. A silence followed. Victoria laughed nervously. I wish people in this village would stop inventing nouns. Mrs. Bramble didn't smile. They're older than the village. That evening Charles insisted on reading more of the journal. Near the back was a folded map, yellow with age. He carefully unfolded it. It showed the village, or rather the village beneath the village. A maze of tunnels ran beneath every street. Smugglers' passages, sea caves, hidden chambers, and one tunnel was marked with a red cross. Besides it, someone had written, the old chapel. Mrs. Bramble leaned forward. I've never seen that page. You've never read the whole journal? No. The keepers only read what they're meant to. Charles looked up. Where is this? She traced the map with one finger. Beneath the eastern cliffs. The path you told us never to take? Yes. Oliver grinned. So that's exactly where we're going. No, Mrs. Bramble answered instantly. That's exactly where they want you to go. A sudden gust of wind slammed the back door. The entire cottage shook. From somewhere below the floor came a deep groan. Not wood, not stone, something else, something alive. The candles flickered violently. The grandfather clock in the hallway began striking 1, 2, 3. It continued 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. It finally stopped at 30. No one spoke. Oliver looked at the clock. It can't do that. Mrs. Bramble's face had become as white as a tablecloth. It hasn't, she swallowed, since 1979. Charles carefully folded the map. Tomorrow, he looked around the room, we're not waiting to be led anywhere. We find the old chapel, we discover how this covenant began, and then, he looked at Mrs. Bramble, we end it. Mrs. Bramble wanted to tell him he couldn't be ended, that generations had tried, that the sea had always won. Instead, for the first time in 30 years, she allowed herself something she had long ago buried: hope. Outside, hidden by the gathering mist, Reverend Crowther stood at the top of the lane. He watched the candle burning in Ashcombe's kitchen. Beside him stood Mr. Fletcher the butcher, the baker, Miss Havers, and dozens of other villagers. None of them spoke. At last, Mr. Fletcher broke the silence. They've opened the whole journal. The Reverend nodded. They know about Ravenswake and the old chapel. The butcher shifted uneasily. Should we stop them? The Reverend looked out towards the sea, far beyond the harbour, where the moonlight touched the water. Something vast disturbed the surface just for a moment. A ripple, far too large to have been made by any boat. No, the Reverend said quietly. They must choose freely. He turned and walked back towards the church. Otherwise, he glanced once more at Seafarer's Rest. The covenant won't hold. High above the cliffs, the ancient lighthouse swept its beam across the black water. For the briefest instant, something impossibly large reflected the light. An eye. Then it was gone. Chapter 10. Saturday, 26th of July, 1986. Charles Ashcombe had slept for precisely 37 minutes. He knew because he'd spent the rest of the night staring at the luminous hands of his travel alarm clock, wondering if he could sue an ancient supernatural covenant for ruining a perfectly respectable holiday. By 6 o'clock he gave up. He padded downstairs in his dressing gown. Mrs. Bramble was already in the kitchen. Naturally, a pot of tea sat between them before either had spoken. I've been thinking, Charles said. Mrs. Bramble nodded. It won't help. I've noticed. Outside, dawn crept over Gulls End. The village looked almost painfully beautiful. Golden sunlight warmed the honey-coloured stone cottages. Fishing boats bobbed gently in the harbour. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys. The scent of fresh bread drifted through the air. If postcards could lie, this was what they looked like. Victoria joined her father at the window. I hate this place. Charles looked at her. No, you hate what it expects. She thought about that. I suppose I do. Breakfast was strangely subdued. Even Oliver wasn't hungry. That alone should have alarmed everyone. Mrs. Bramble placed a folded Ordnance Survey map on the table. I've marked the entrance. Charles looked up. I thought you said never to use the eastern path. I did. But today, she sighed, it's the only way. At 7:30, they slipped out through the back garden, not the front. Mrs. Bramble insisted. The front belongs to the village. The back still belongs to us. No one questioned what that meant. The eastern cliff path was narrower than the western one. Older too. Grass had swallowed much of it. Brambles clawed at the clothes. The sea crashed against the black rocks far below. Victoria glanced behind them. Is it just me, or is it quieter? Oliver frowned. There aren't any birds. She looked up. He was right. Not a single gull circled overhead. For a seaside village, the silence felt wrong. After 20 minutes, they reached the weathered stone marker. Half buried beneath ivy, someone had chiselled a raven into its face. Below it were 4 words. Remember who fed you. Charles ran his fingers over the carving. That doesn't sound particularly Christian. Mrs. Bramble shook her head. It isn't. The entrance to the tunnel was almost invisible. A crack in the cliff face, no wider than a wardrobe. Cold air drifted from within. It carried the smell of wet stone and something older, something that reminded Charles of opening a long-forgotten cellar. Oliver switched on his torch. Its beam disappeared into the darkness. No turning back? Victoria asked. Charles smiled thinly. I suspect that was yesterday. The tunnel sloped steadily downwards. Water dripped from the ceiling. Their footsteps echoed endlessly. Every now and then they passed strange carvings cut into the rock. Not words, symbols. Circles crossed by 13 lines. Oliver stopped. I've seen these before. The posts on the beach. Mrs. Bramble nodded. They're boundary marks. Boundary for what? She didn't answer. Instead, she whispered, walk in the middle. No one touched the walls. After what felt like half an hour, the passage widened. Before them stood an ancient wooden door, bound with rusted iron. Above it someone had carved St. Cuthbert's Chapel. Charles frowned. I thought you said this was the old chapel. Mrs. Bramble nodded. It was, once. Victoria looked around. It doesn't feel very holy. No, Mrs. Bramble whispered. It stopped being holy a very long time ago. The hinges groaned as Charles pushed the door open. Beyond lay a vast underground chamber. Oliver gasped. It was beautiful and terrible. Stone pillars rose from the floor like the trunks of ancient trees. At the centre stood a small Norman chapel. Its roof had partially collapsed centuries ago. Seawater shimmered around its foundations. The tide has somehow found its way beneath the cliffs. Felicity whispered, "It's incredible." Mrs. Bramble quietly replied, "It wasn't here when they built it." Charles frowned. "What?" "The sea. It found the chapel later." Victoria wandered towards a faded wall painting. Much of it had crumbled away. Enough remained: a priest, villagers, a great black wave, something rising within it. Not a fish, not a whale, not anything she recognized. Its shape had been deliberately scratched away. Who did this? Mrs. Bramble looked at the mural. Our ancestors. Why? So no one could remember its face. Oliver had discovered the chapel altar. It was surprisingly plain, just worn limestone, except there was a deep groove running across its centre, too neat to be accidental. Charles looked at it. "It looks like—" Mrs. Bramble finished the sentence. "A channel." Nobody spoke. They all understood. Victoria wandered behind the altar. There, almost hidden beneath centuries of dust, stood another journal, smaller, bound in black leather. She picked it up. Mrs. Bramble inhaled sharply. "No!" Too late. The cover fell open. A loose page drifted gently to the floor. Charles picked it up. The handwriting was medieval Latin. Beneath it, someone had added a Victorian translation. He began reading aloud. "This place was built for God. The bargain was not made here. It was broken here." Charles frowned. "What does that mean?" Mrs. Bramble slowly sat down on one of the ancient pews. "It means the first villagers lied." Everyone turned. "What?" She looked towards the flooded doorway. "The sea never came to Ravenswake. They went looking for it." Charles lowered the page. "They summoned it?" Mrs. Bramble nodded. "Out of greed. They already had enough to live. They wanted more. Bigger captures, safer voyages, prosperity. So," Victoria whispered, "they started this." Mrs. Bramble closed her eyes. "Yes, they invited it." A deep rumble echoed through the cavern. Dust drifted from the ceiling. The water surrounding the chapel rippled. Not from the tide, from something moving beneath it. Oliver slowly shone his torch across the flooded floor. The beam caught footprints, fresh, leading into the black water, not away from it, towards it. Charles frowned. "We're not the first ones here." A familiar voice answered from the darkness. "No." Reverend Crowther stepped into the torchlight. He was alone, without his black coat, without his smile. For the first time, he looked every one of his 70 years. "I was beginning to think you'd never come." Charles instinctively stepped in front of his family. "You've been following us." The Reverend nodded. "For 30 years." Charles blinked. "I'm afraid you've lost me." "I wasn't waiting for you, Mr. Ashcombe." He looked towards Mrs. Bramble. I was waiting for someone brave enough to open the whole journal. Mrs. Bramble stared at him. You knew. I wrote the last page. Victoria frowned. The one about us? No. He looked at the ancient altar. The page after it. Mrs. Bramble's face drained of colour. There was another page. The Reverend nodded sadly. One eye removed. He reached into his coat, carefully unfolded a yellowed sheet of paper. And I think it's time you all read it. The underground chapel shook again. This time, the sound did not come from above. It came from beneath the altar, like something enormous turning over in its sleep. Chapter 11, Saturday, 26th of July, 1986. The missing page trembled in Reverend Crowther's hands. For a long moment nobody spoke. The only sound was the slow surge of seawater beneath the chapel floor. Charles broke the silence. Well, if you've got a miraculous solution hidden in there, now would be an excellent time. For the first time since the Ashcombe family had met him, the Reverend smiled without warmth. I rather wish I had. He unfolded the page. The parchment crackled like dry leaves. It wasn't removed to hide the truth from outsiders. He looked at Mrs. Bramble. It was hidden from us. His voice echoed around the ancient chapel. Know this. The sea does not demand sacrifice. It demands obedience. The covenant endures only while the people believe themselves bound. When the innocent are offered willingly, the village prospers. When the innocent refuse, the bargain ends. The price shall not be paid by strangers. His voice faltered. Then he read the final line, but by those who first made it. The water lapped gently against the stone floor. Mrs. Bramble whispered, all these years. The Reverend nodded. We never finished the page. We were told never to. Charles stared at him. So all this time you've been murdering innocent people? For nothing? The Reverend looked utterly broken. No, for fear. Above them the chapel groaned. Dust rained from the ceiling. The sea surged another foot across the floor. Oliver looked down. The water's rising. Mrs. Bramble didn't take her eyes off the page. It's come to collect. Reverend Crowther folded the page. The underground chapel trembled. Dust drifted from the ancient beams as seawater seeped steadily across the flagstones. Charles stepped protectively in front of Felicity, Victoria, and Oliver. Reverend Crowther looked at them with an expression that was almost pity. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I truly am. Before Charles could reply, footsteps echoed through the tunnel behind them. Dozens of footsteps. Slow, measured, unhurried. Mrs. Bramble turned towards the sound. One by one, the villagers emerged from the darkness. Mr. Fletcher, Miss Havers, Mrs. Pollard, the butcher, the baker, the fisherman, the children, every smiling face they had met since arriving in Gulls End. Together they carried something between them, a great wicker basket, beautifully woven from fresh willow, large enough for an entire family. They lowered it gently onto the chapel floor. Not a word was spoken. The only sound was a distant roar of the tide beneath the cliffs. Oliver's voice was barely a whisper. "Dad!" Charles stared at the basket, then slowly turned towards Mrs. Bramble. She could not meet his eyes. For several long seconds she stood motionless. Then she walked across the chapel and stopped beside Reverend Crowther. Her shoulders sagged with exhaustion. When she finally spoke, her voice was almost inaudible. "I have them here for you, Reverend." She swallowed hard. "I did as you asked me." A tear escaped down her cheek. "For the sake of the village." Silence filled the chapel. Victoria looked at her in disbelief. "No!" Mrs. Bramble closed her eyes. "I'm so sorry." Felicity shook her head. "You knew?" Mrs. Bramble nodded once. "From the moment I met you." Charles stared at the woman who had cooked their meals, washed their clothes, bandaged Oliver's knee, laughed at the dinner table, and tucked extra slices of cake into his lunch. "You were one of them?" Mrs. Bramble's face crumpled. "I never stopped being one of them. I only prayed that somehow I wouldn't have to choose." Reverend Crowther rested a gentle hand on her. "You've done the right thing, Edith." She looked at him with hollow eyes. "Have I?" No one answered. Behind the ashcombs, the villagers stood in complete silence, waiting. The great wicker basket sat between them and the tunnel entrance, patiently, as though it had been waiting there for centuries. Well, my darlings, I truly do hope you have enjoyed Gulls End. I really enjoyed writing it for you. It's been an absolute pleasure, and it's my little gift to you for being away for an entire week. Now don't have nightmares, my lovelies, and I'll be back as normal on Monday next week. Good night, my sweethearts. Good night.